Thank you so much for coming. I want to welcome members of the CU community, that is, faculty, students, and staff. But I also want to welcome visitors from the outside. We have some distinguished visitors who are from the embassies of various countries. We have visitors from the government of Hungary. We bid them welcome. We've got visitors from civil society. Thank you all for being here. This is the beginning of a project as your rector whose purpose is to get our community to think hard about our mission. As you know, we have a mission that's connected to the values of open society. One of my concerns, frankly, is that we don't want to be the kind of institution that pays lip service to a bunch of words and we never ask critically what it means. And one of my second concerns is to make sure that a set of values and ideals that were connected to the idea of open society, as we shall see in my talk, dates back to 1945, are these ideals relevant in a very, very changed world today? What account must we take of the new international situation? So this is not just any talk. This is a talk about the values central to this institution. And it initiates a whole series of seminars, and you're all welcome to come to all of them. I don't expect you'll all be able to make every one of them, and I'm not taking attendance. But the purpose is to get us to think as a community what the heck we actually believe. That's the purpose, intellectual purpose. To engage honestly, also this important purpose, with the criticisms that the Open Society mission is receiving, both in this country and in other countries. To engage honestly, to learn from those criticisms, to rethink basic assumptions. So that's the purpose of this seminar series that will work this semester and then work next semester. Possibly ending up in a publication when we've got it all together and looked at what we've got. And I wanted to lead it because as your new president, it's important I figure out what these values mean. I'm a historian by training, so my approach will be an intellectual history of this idea and an attempt to see how it's changed in the last 60, 70 years. Okay, and I'll be asking some tough questions, some questions that don't have easy answers, that are deliberately intended to challenge this audience to think again about ideals and values that I think we too often take for granted. Just a little announcement. There's this talk tonight, and then very unusually, there's a talk tomorrow. So for those who are gluttons for punishment, there will be a discussion tomorrow night in this room with a very, very considerable figure in Anglo-American intellectual life. That's Mark Lilla, who's a professor of the humanities at Columbia and wrote a critique of the politics of identity, which was a critique of the intellectual mindset that produced the Hillary Clinton campaign, a very devastating critique of that campaign by Mark Lilla that was the most single-read piece of commentary in the wake of the November 9th election on the editorial pages of the New York Times. So this is a person of intellectual depth, but also considerable current relevance. He'll be here tomorrow at 5:30. Right here for a conversation with me and with you about the ethics of identity, the politics of identity, and the politics of reaction. Okay, let's do a little work. I've got some slides. Here's very roughly the menu. Who were open society's old enemies when the idea is created in 1945 in Karl Popper's work? What was his target? What are the new enemies of open society? That is, the new adversaries, the new opponents. worthy opponents, opponents to be taken with the greatest seriousness. And then the most difficult question of all for a community like ours, should we be rethinking the ideal? Has it outlived its usefulness? That's a question that will remain open through the year, but it's a question I want this community to ask, and ask honestly. Very, very briefly, the intellectual history of Karl Popper is a Viennese refugee from Austro-fascism, leaves in the mid-30s, Jewish, assimilated. This is an idea, open society, whose deepest intellectual roots are in Central and Eastern Europe, in Vienna, as we shall see, in Riga, and in Germany. One of the key features of open society right away is a sense of it being anti-utopian. A very strong sense that we want a political ideal that does not promise too much, that prevents the worst. So how can we organize political institutions so that bad or incompetent rulers can be prevented from doing too much damage? That is lowering the bar of political expectation from the radiant tomorrows promised particularly by Hitler and by Stalin. But Karl Popper is not alone, and it's extremely important for us to situate him in the intellectual history of post-war Europe. Hannah Arendt, another Jewish refugee from totalitarian tyranny, gets to New York and writes this fantastic book, Origins of Totalitarianism. If any student in this room has not read From Origins of Totalitarianism, there's something wrong with us. So you gotta read some Hannah Arendt. A theme that comes through in Hannah Arendt in all of this open society work is a caution, a skepticism about using history to predict the future, using history to justify ruthlessness in politics, using history with the claim that it offers a science to the future, attempting to rescue history from politics and rescue politics from history. Caution in handling generally accepted opinions that claim to expand the whole trends of history is especially important for the historian of modern times because the last century has produced an abundance of ideologies that pretend to be keys to history. Marx says that Marxism is the key to history and knows itself to be such. Open society is an act of rebellion against that very idea of history and use of history. A third figure, not the only figure to put in this history of the people who create the idea of open society, is Isaiah Berlin, Jewish refugee from Russian totalitarianism, born in Riga, comes to Oxford. He develops two concepts of liberty. And here would be a third element, I think, of the idea of open society is a foundational commitment to freedom. Freedom from interference, freedom from imprisonment, freedom from enslavement. And above all, notice this, personal freedom is to seek to serve interference, exploitation, enslavement by men whose ends are theirs, not one's own. A passionate belief in the right of human beings to choose ends for themselves, to serve those ends as best they see fit, as opposed to a vision of politics, of freedom too, in which a society shapes collective ends and individuals serve those ends. A passionate belief that each of us must be sovereign in the choices we make of our own lives. This is the individualism, the moral individualism, in many ways, that's the core of the idea of open society. Who are the old enemies that these three thinkers, there are many more thinkers besides Talman, Arendt, and Berlin, but the enemies that they are identifying are the totalitarians, we tend to forget the sense in which Hitler, Stalin mount a anti-liberal revolution against parliamentary democracy, against individual freedoms, against human rights, in the name of a transcendent, all-shaping political ideology whose purpose is literally to remake human beings. The results are violent, exterminatory, and these are also closed societies, anti-global societies, societies that want to create a single paradise on earth, totally dominated by their economic system. The second enemy that the open society ideologists that I've defined identify as being their interlocutor are not the totalitarian societies from without, but communist fellow travelers in Western societies within. I don't mean fellow travelers in a negative sense. I mean it in the technical sense that if you look at who Karl Popper and Berlin and Arendt are talking to, they're talking to Western Marxists, great figures, Eric Hobsbawm, Edward Thompson, Christopher Hill in Britain, and the communists associated with the French Communist Party in France. We forget that the extent to which the enemies that open society are dealing with are not exterior in totalitarian societies outside. They're located at the heart of Western liberal democracies in the post-war period, and this is the enemy that Karl Popper, Isaiah Berlin, and others are most concerned about. In addition, so those are enemies, as it were, on the left. There's some enemies on the right. People who don't like the moral individualism of capitalist society, who have a basic quarrel with capitalist modernity. And one of the things that makes open society a profound ideology and an interesting ideology is the space that Karl Popper gives to what he calls the strain of civilization. All of these thinkers are anti-utopian in the specific sense that they don't want to persuade you that liberal democratic freedom is a walk in the park. They all want to say it's lonely, frightening, and disorienting to live in societies where you have the responsibility of personal freedom, where you have the political responsibility of political choice, and where you're living in the hurricane of what Joseph Schumpeter called the creative destruction of the capitalist order. When Popper talks about the strain of civilization, he's saying that's what it is to live in a liberal democracy. You're living with the burden of responsibility, and you're living with the strain of adapting to constant, unforeseen, and unexpected change. It's not an apologia, in other words, for open society. I mean, it's a defense of it, but it attempts to say, look, if you believe in open society, you're letting yourself in for the strain of civilization, the struggle to remain a responsible political actor and remain serene and confident in the face of modernity's ceaseless creative destruction. Their final enemy, again, is what Popper calls historicism, and that really is not just a view of history as being determinist, materialist, and positivist, but a whole attempt to think that human beings can guide politics with a science of history. Trying to to believe in an open society is to believe that we have very little capacity to master the future ex ante. We have a considerable capacity to understand it ex post, but we have part of living with the strain of civilization in open society is to live with an open future. To live with an open future of which we are unafraid. The critique of historicism is kind of saying to us, this is modern life, get used to it. There's a certain stoic element to the vision of open society that I think we need to think about. If you then put all this together as a package, what you have is liberal democratic constitutionalism. I mean, these folks come to Britain and they come to the United States and they basically take the Madisonian constitutional machine and say, that's fine. That's the best political system we can find. We'll take it. They have nothing very much to say about the institutional order of an open society. They simply take it off the shelf from British constitutionalism and Madisonian constitutionalism in the United States. On economics, I think it's important to notice, because open society in 2016 is so associated with neoliberalism, red in tooth and claw, that in fact the economics that has their support in the 40s is Keynesian demand management, social market, welfare state economics. It's a redistributive, welfarist vision of organizing a capitalist economy. Their change model is what Popper calls piecemeal social engineering, a phrase that George Soros repeats very frequently. Piecemeal social engineering, as opposed to the engineering of human souls made famous by Joseph Stalin and the infamous forms of social engineering that we associate with Hitler. The most interesting aspect of open society thinking to me, and the one that's most central to my practice as a rector, relates to the epistemology. We need to remember the sense in which Karl Popper was a philosopher and historian of science. And so for him, the core of a free society, an open society, is actually the scientific method. The constant falsification of theory. The attempt always to make theory, revise theory, discard theory when the facts don't fit the theory anymore. That constant sense of all theory is conditional, provisional, a deep commitment to facing reality in all its difficulty. Having the courage as an academic community to notice when the theory doesn't fit and discard the theory rather than the facts. There's an epistemology there, but there's also an ethics of knowledge there, which seems to me, of all the parts of the Popper legacy, it's the epistemology, the commitment to scientific truth at whatever cost. It seems to me the most astringent and valuable thing he ever said, and is the distinctive contribution of Popper to the whole political vision of open society. With that epistemology, respect for reality, respect for facts, and willingness to change your mind when the facts no longer fit the theory, from that epistemology, Popper develops an ethics of tolerance. You may be right, I may be wrong. Tolerance is then connected to a relationship to truth, in which you're willing to change your views because you think someone else actually may be right. Moral individualism follows because our relationship to facts is an individual relationship. We have an individual moral relationship to get things right, to get reality right for us. So the epistemology is driving the ethics, and it's also driving the individualism. And as I've said before, this is an ideology of freedom, not an ideology of equality. It puts a strong premise on individual freedom, and we'll see that as a problematic priority, but a vital one to understanding what open society is all about. And as I think I've hinted before, there's a metaphysics here. There's an idea essentially that to live in an open society, to live in liberal freedom, is to live in a world in which you accept, this is Alexander Herzen's wonderful remark, that history has no libretto. We just don't know what the hell is going to happen next. And we have to live in equanimity. We have to live in reconciliation with the limits of our knowledge, the limits of our capacity for predictive judgments. And it's better to live in that ignorance than to walk around with tyrannous certainties about how the future can be made to be shaped by political engineering. Clearly, in international terms, this is a Cold War ideology that takes for granted an international order guaranteed by the United States. One of the things that I wanted to point out, I've tried to sketch the intellectual history in very rough terms of what the open society idea was about. But I think it's very important to situate it in its time. One of the reasons that open society is under attack is that open society is associated with the liberal revolution of which it was a part. Open society takes shape as an anti-totalitarian ideology in the 40s, and the 40s, 50s, and 60s are crucially what happens in the history of the world since 1945 is decolonization. The liberation of colonial peoples, the enshrining of self-determination as the moral principle of international relations. This is what's happening internationally. Crucially, the other domestic change that changes everything in the world is the U.S. Civil Rights Revolution and the example it gives to civil society around the world. Without the Civil Rights Revolution, you do not have the sexual revolution, you do not have feminism, you do not have a whole revolution in individual freedom, which is not always powered by liberals, progressives, Marxists, communists, conservatives, libertarians pour into this, but its consequences, its effects are liberal. To create a world in which we have a sense that all of us have a right to personal freedom, to personal expressive freedom, to sexual freedoms, to equality between men and women and gays. This revolution, it seems to me, is the background condition in which open society ideology flourished in the 60s and 70s. It didn't initiate the liberal revolution, but it forms part of the liberal revolution. By the early 70s, it's important to notice that some of the post-war open society liberal ideology, as it encounters the economic and social crisis of the 1970s and the rightward turn that is created in that moment with Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, that some of the intellectual firepower for the Thatcher and Reagan revolution is actually supplied by some of the people who were present at the open society revolution in the 1940s. Someone like Hayek is crucial to the thinking of Mrs. Thatcher. Karl Popper is much more distant, but what I'm saying here is by the 70s and 80s, open society for many people takes on an increasingly neoliberal complexion, in which suddenly open society, having championed the Keynesian welfare state, begins to draw back from the Keynesian welfare state on the ground that it's extremely expensive, extremely oppressive to individual liberty. Open society begins to split in this period in the 70s and 80s. And if open society is then accused of being neoliberal, this is where the trouble starts in the mid-1970s. Let me move on. I now want to get to stuff that's closer to home and closer to Hungary and closer to Eastern Europe. Open society then has a completely new and unexpected life. It's an idea that starts in Vienna, in Freiburg, in Riga. It has deep roots in the Jewish refugee exodus from Eastern and Central Europe during fascism and Soviet times. And then it makes this strange return to Eastern Europe in the 1970s. George Soros makes a lot of money, has a deep commitment to Hungary and to Eastern Europe, he is a student of Popper, begins to use open society to describe what his philanthropic objectives are, and begins, bringing in fax machines to help dissidents, begins to link up with the dissident movements. And to the degree that open society develops a change model, a model of how we in open society movements could aid the transition, that change model doesn't come from Western Europe or off the shelf or from Karl Popper's books. It comes from Václav Havel. It comes from Solidarity. It comes from the activists in Eastern Europe who are faced with the fact that they cannot overthrow these regimes by force. They have to resort to what Václav Havel calls the power of the powerless. Popular mobilization from below, whose purpose is to drain the moral legitimacy of these totalitarian states from out from under the states, so that the states continue to have coercive power, but they lack the power to compel, to conjure up allegiance and faith in the Eastern European public. And as we know, that process of depriving totalitarian closed regimes of their moral legitimacy is essentially civil society's finest hour in Eastern Europe, particularly evident in the Czech Republic and in Poland, but also to some degree also in Hungary, Romania, and other places. The dissidents then are propelled to power by these revolutions from below, these civil society revolutions, and then trouble starts. My analysis would be that many of the liberals, the civil society liberals, fail to institutionalize. They fail to create stable political instruments to maintain and reproduce their power. One little example of this is Václav Havel. Havel becomes president in the Czech Republic, but never creates a Havel political party, never creates a machine that would allow him and the liberal dissidents to institutionalize their capacity to reproduce power and political order. And that failure of liberals to institutionalize, to develop political instruments of power, seems to me to be one of the things that prepared the ground for other political forces with a more effective sense of how to create institutions, parties of political power. Liberals, I think, ceded the ground, unfortunately, to these groups. This is an area where I hope we will have many discussions, and I'm sure I have much to learn. I may have it all wrong, but that's just my thought. In early 2000, from the 1990s, the transitions are incentivized by the European Union, which creates a whole set of very positive institutional incentives. And the incentives are all directed towards creating an open society. That is, a liberal democracy with separation of powers, free media, free civil society. And as long as that accession process is working, the incentive system orients towards the creation of open society. But once the accession process is complete, the incentives weaken dramatically, and the capacity of Western Europe to incentivize Eastern Europe to be an open society basically begins to collapse. This is coincident with another thing that isn't really noticed at the time, which is the gradual withdrawal of the United States from setting the incentives for Western European integration. Donald Trump is saying, I don't care about Europe in 2017, but this process of disengagement from Europe has been going on a very long time. Probably Dayton, 1995, is the last moment in which the United States really took active, relentless, detailed political and military commitment to the integration of Europe. And since then, Western European incentives have weakened, American incentives have weakened, and when the economic transitions begin to stall, this creates the ground in which new regimes begin to take power in Eastern Europe. Just to spell it out, The transitions create a populist backlash. I think it's important there are good reasons for this. EU accession incentives weaken. The migration crisis is extremely poorly handled, threatens liberal democratic order everywhere. Eastern European societies look at Western European societies and make some very difficult judgments. I mean, judgments that are based on their own history. We don't want to be multicultural. We don't want to be multi-ethnic. We don't want to be like you. We want to take our own path into modernity. And this seems to me, creates a popular base in which national populist forces essentially begin to run against a Western European vision of open society. This is a global phenomenon. Russia has a terrible experience of the transition to open society in the 1990s. The arrival of open society in Russia is an experience of Soviet collapse, economic collapse, Wild West capitalism, disintegration of public order, collapse of the Soviet welfare state. That's how open society comes to Russia in the 1990s. If that's your experience of open society, you don't want anything to do with it. I'm simplifying, I'm being even aggressive in my formulations, but it's no surprise that there is the gradual emergence of an alternative to open society. You go to the one institution that still works, the FSB, the security services, you pick the brightest guy in that security system, and he then makes a deal for regime stability with the oligarchs who benefited from the privatizations, and you create basically a new form of capitalist autocracy, capitalist in the sense that oligarchs get entry into the global market, but autocracy in the sense that the FSB regime guarantees order. The Chinese go through a similar encounter with openness. They go through the chaos and disorder and fear of the Cultural Revolution. They come out of it. They think we've got to open to the capitalist order. They open to the capitalist economy. And by the late 90s, early 2000s, they begin to see at some point open societies' freedoms, that is, free markets, free ideas, free institutions, will threaten the monopoly of single-party rule. They've made a very clear strategic choice to consolidate single-party rule at the expense of open society. And in Western societies, in Western Europe, liberal centrist parties, I can speak with some authority here, being a tried and true liberal centrist, working in the Canadian political context, we often failed the test of an economic crisis, a crisis of widening inequality, the constant buffeting of basic existential security by terrorism. All of this has eroded the legitimacy of the political center and created an opening for populist majoritarianism that essentially rejects many of the values of the open society. And so you have, I'm simplifying radically, three new enemies: single-party autocracies, illiberal democracies. I choose illiberal democracies because that's the phrase used by the current Prime Minister of Hungary. Turkey, it seems to me, post-coup is experimenting with its distinctive form of an illiberal democracy. And then you have the phenomenon of the democratic populists seizing upon the failure of liberal centrism to solve the crises of the last 15 years. And I think we're in what could be described as a counter-revolutionary moment. It feels like 1815 in Europe. You know, we had the French Revolution, we had Napoleon, and now we've got Restoration, reaction, Metternich, the call back to order. That's a metaphor, of course. It's a historical extrapolation, but I think it gives us some sense of what's going on. In the international dimension, if you have a transactional American president, what is transactional is that human rights will not figure in the transactions with foreign states. Human rights will not figure in the bilateral and multilateral instruments that the United States does going further. You cannot imagine a new era of humanitarian intervention driven by human rights principles. You have everywhere, in response to economic crisis, terrorism, and fear, a return to the logic of the sovereign state in international relations. You have a return to great power politics in which the transactions that will be done about Ukraine and Crimea and Syria remain to be written, but we can imagine what those transactions would look like. In domestic politics, what is, I think, the most interesting phenomenon is that some of the attacks on liberal checks and balances that we saw first in Eastern Europe as new regimes sought to consolidate populist majoritarianism as a form of rule, some of that attack on liberal checks and balances are now spreading into Western Europe and even in the United States. For the first time in my lifetime, a sense that Madisonian constitutionalism is the key to public liberty, to limiting the power of the state. All of that, those liberal assumptions are in question. My third point would be, I said that open society was deeply connected to the idea of the liberal revolution, the revolution that brought us some measure of sexual equality, some measure of sexual freedom, equality for gay men and women, and the politics of civil rights. I think central to the counter-revolution is a re-questioning of that story that starts with Rosa Parks and the Birmingham bus boycott in 1945, that includes the heroes who fought for equal rights for women, the Stonewall generation that fought for equal rights for gay Americans. These battles that may have sometimes started in the United States and other parts of Europe, then globalized, and there has been a global counter-reaction against them. A reaction in Islam, reaction in populist parties in Western and in Eastern Europe. The old trope in which Eastern Europe was kind of off the liberal reservation and Western Europe was still on, no longer applies. The counter-revolution is breaking down those barriers, and when political correctness is attacked, it's code for an attack not just on a few positions, it's an attack on a history of liberal revolution since 1945. One of the things I want to point out about the new enemies, however, which raises a problem for the coherence of open society as a theory, is that the enemies are not closed. The open-closed distinction doesn't quite work here when you look at it. If you look at the Visegrad Four, they're members of NATO. They're members of the European Union. They're deeply dependent on Schengen. They're deeply dependent on inward investment. They require the ability to place capital outside. The old closed open distinction that animated Karl Popper's differentiation between totalitarian and open society simply doesn't work here. We're in a different world in which there's the new enemies of open society are essentially global, integrated into the global international economy in ways that we need to understand. In China, you're not looking at Mao's China, you're looking at what I call a regime of divisible freedom, in which the Chinese have the right to exit, have the right to buy an apartment in Vancouver, have a right to deposit their gains in Western banks. And the key point about this openness or this access to globalization is that it's an enormously important stabilizer of these regimes, because it means that you don't have voice, to use Albert Hirschman's distinction, but you have exit. These regimes are stable and long-term stable because they provide exit. If you don't like it, you can go and live in London. If you don't like it, you can go and live somewhere else. If you don't like it, you can take your money. And if you're doing business with a regime where you fear that they may impound or steal your money, they allow you to deposit your holdings in rule of law countries overseas, so that stabilizes your relationship with the regime. So these are areas where I think the open-closed discussion needs to be deeply rethought, because we're not looking at the simple antinomy that we saw in the 1945 version of this story. Now, let's get, since I am going to, I don't want to go on too much further, let's then look at, if open society is under challenge, what is the nature of the challenge? I see three areas in which this is the case. The open society change model is anti-democratic. That is, you have external funding sources for domestic civil society, and that amounts to an intervention, an illicit intervention in the domestic political processes of a society. This is not just happening, this argument is not just happening in Hungary or the Czech Republic or in Poland, where there is resistance and criticism of foreign funding of civil society. It's also happening in India, in perfectly democratic societies. So this is an important challenge to the open society change model. The second criticism is very different, which is that open society is simply neoliberalism dressed up and prettified, and as such is a violation of the economic sovereignty of nation states. And the third criticism is that open society values are a form of political correctness, and what's bad about political correctness is it's what used to be called, when I was an undergraduate, repressive tolerance. That is to say, people who believe in open society take their views as truth in a way that make them utterly unreceptive to any criticism. Open society, in other words, has become an ideology instead of a set of values. Open society values have become closed values, values that no longer admit or allow argument or rebuttal. And these are serious criticisms, and you hear them from a variety of sources, and a university like ours had better think about these elements seriously, and take them seriously and think about them. What can we say in defense, just so you don't think I'm leaving us completely defenseless and capitulating to these arguments? Open society, anti-democratic. The whole purpose of civil society funding is to defend vulnerable minorities from majorities, and to enable, in societies where liberal constitutionalism is under attack, to sustain those institutions that provide and hold government to account. Politically correct? Well, if it's politically correct to defend the liberal revolution, that is, the emancipation of women and gays and persons of color, then we plead guilty. The difficulty here is that in Eastern Europe, multiculturalism and multi-ethnicity are still foreign concepts for reasons that have to do with the tragic history of this part of the world. And so even if you defend those values, you've still got a battle here, because what you're being told is that may apply in Berlin or London or New York, but it's not going to work in Budapest. It's not going to work in Prague. It's not going to work in Warsaw. As for open society being an apologia for neoliberalism, yes, there is truth to the fact that certain parts of the open society, as I said, split in the 1970s and aligned themselves with Thatcher and Reagan. But the mainstream defense of open society has always been a defense of Keynesian, liberal, democratic, welfarist, redistributive role for the state. I've only got 2 more slides, and I really am going to stop. If you widen this out and you really start to think about what we have to think about in the year ahead, these are just some of the questions that I think we need to think about. Did open society neglect the nation? By which I mean, did we neglect the deep longing and need for national identity and belonging? The deep political and popular need for having a sense that you live in a country that is sovereign particularly over its borders. Is there some sense in which open society became the ideology of a liberal cosmopolitan elite who did very well from globalization, and because it did, neglected those who hadn't done so well from globalization? Did we essentially neglect or fail to understand the radically differential impact of globalization as a social experience? Did open society as an ideology, it's written in the 1940s essentially, it's very male in its structure, it does not necessarily take into account the sense in which an open society that is liberal democratic grants voice to some and defies or denies voice to others? Did we think carefully enough about the structures of exclusion at the heart of open liberal democracies? Next question, and this is framed obviously by the post-truth environment we're in. Wasn't there something naive about a Popperian epistemology in which political epistemology is modeled on scientific epistemology, in which sovereign individuals carefully weigh truth claims and theoretical claims against empirical claims and make individual sovereign judgments? That doesn't look like what's happening in the arena, the agora of public discussion. Is there something deeply missing in open society's account of how it is that citizens get news, learn news, and winnow the truth from the chaff of lies and deception? Clearly, it seems to me, open society assumed that the truth will out, and there is absolutely zero guarantee that that's the case. And a final point in general about the change model is, did open society put too much faith in civil society, in the idea of self-organizing groups that would hold governments to account, mobilize electorates, create political movements of peaceful change? We have seen, on the contrary, that in this society and other societies, it is effortlessly easy, in fact, for governments to use police power, invigilative power, investigative power, tax power to basically make it impossible for civil society to work effectively as a change agent. And so if that's the case, are there things about the change model that we need to think anew? I'm now really at the last moment here. What can I say when I sum up, when I turn it more personally and ask, what is it about open society that I, as a thinking person, have learned? I still feel that the openness, the idea of openness, is one of the most difficult things to actually live, to be open to oneself, to hear the inner voices of doubt. The inner voices of doubt are crucial to good political judgment. To be willing to notice that the ideology, the values you have are not coinciding with new realities requires openness to oneself, openness to others, openness to doubt. And that seems to me a moral attitude towards reality and to political life of enormous enormous importance. And it's the key to an honest approach to politics. The other thing about open society is the word society. This is not a form of crude moral individualism. The conditions of openness are social. No one can be an open person unless they live in a society that sustains and creates the condition for openness for all. And the other insight, it seems to me, of an open society is simply the logic which was original to their commitment in the 1940s, that freedom depends on counterpower. That freedom is not majoritarian democracy. Freedom is counterpower. Majorities balanced by minorities, governments balanced by civil society, governments balanced by a free press, and that these are the conditions for freedom. And the final point, and almost the most difficult, because I think that populists, parties in Western Europe and Eastern Europe are seizing on and reaching down into very deep human anxieties of fear, longing for belonging, longing for meaning, longing for purpose. An open society view of the world has to recognize those fears and anxieties, but has to be very resolute in saying, if you believe in open society, you believe in the adventure of modernity. You believe in living in a world where history has no libretto. You believe that you're living in a world of radical uncertainty, and you're not afraid. You're not afraid. Open society is a very confident vision, but makes a very large demand that ordinary citizens can conquer the fears that modernity and change and violence awaken in all of us. And with that, I'll stop and hope we can have a discussion. And I'm sorry I went on a little long. Thank you for your attention.